Great, this is working, good. Well, I hope it's both engaging and gripping and somewhat uplifting. I think we know we're at this challenging time right now where, thank you, Ken, the world is sending us signals that the planet is changing in a way that is creating a lot of instabilities, and that our continued reliance on fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions is really putting its foot on the pedal in terms of creating a lot of risk. And so I want to talk through today some of the science behind the changes in climate we're seeing in California, and then look at the impact of climate on wildfire risk in the past and what it means perhaps for the future. And then talk a little bit about some of the solutions that we can deploy to help mitigate against some of the risks that we're seeing. And it's exciting to have this opportunity to present this information to the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And you know, we're at a time right now in academia where we realize that we can no longer continue to operate in silos when we're facing systemic challenges. And I think it's great to bring this conference to UC Davis, which is kind of at the epicenter where a lot of the wildfire action has been happening in the state. I also want to add just a bit of a plug for the University of California that under President Napolitano's leadership, we are now, we have the largest renewable energy portfolio of any university in the country. And that's part of the what's called the Carbon Neutrality Initiative, which is seeking to achieve carbon neutrality by 2025. And you know, so there's a lot of great things that are happening locally, but it's not enough. You know, we need both global action and local action to really solve this challenge in front of us. So let's see if I can get this thing to function. Here we go. Well, this is a video. If it plays, you could click on it. So this is just some drone footage from the recent campfire. And, you know, it's flying over some of the communities that were substantially disrupted and destroyed in Paradise. And, you know, what it says is that climate change, which was kind of knocking on our door for a while in the late 90s and early 2000s, has fully entered our living rooms. And these impacts manifest themselves oftentimes in extremes. And so as we continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that causes the Earth's climate to warm, the weather patterns are trying to seek out equilibrium. And since they're changing so quickly, those equilibrium manifests in things like hurricanes, droughts, wildfires. And you know, we're seeing it all over the world, whether it's in India, where there's massive heat waves right now. I'm from the Midwest, and my heart goes out to the farming community that is being devastated through historic floods, so on and so forth. So this is really a global challenge, and in California, we're seeing it more and more in extreme heat events, which are above and beyond the normal record based on all the evidence we have, and an increased incidence of wildfire activity. So we hear a lot about this 1.5 degrees Celsius sort of threshold that we don't want to hit. I like to point out that in California, if you look at an anomaly of climate statewide in terms of temperature over time, we've already hit this point where we're above a 1.5 degree climate in the state of California. And in fact, a couple of years ago, we were about 2 degrees Celsius above the baseline condition already. And this is going to continue to happen in a relatively systematic way over time. And it doesn't mean that we're obviously locked into this above 1.5 degree threshold, but we do know that as the decades continue, we are already in a period in which we have dangerously interfered with the climate system, and that is causing massive changes here in California statewide. And the state is taking this very seriously. I think it's exciting to be in California where we have the right kind of policy environment. We have a cap and trade market, and yet none of that is going to stop the next decade's worth of climate change, because in California we're about a little above 1% of global emissions. So it's great if we can replicate these models as quickly as possible, but we also have to brace for these amazing climate impacts that we're starting to see more and more. And where you are right now, based on a recent analysis that I led with my colleague Jay Lund, included a lot of faculty from across the University of California on the climate assessment that the state continues to run every few years, every 4 years to be precise. If you project out the median climate based on the global climate models for California, where we are will be about as warm as Phoenix today on average. So what that means is that we're moving from a baseline condition of about 4 days of over 104 degrees. That was kind of what we saw in more or less in Sacramento, to something that's going to be above about 40 days per year where it's above 104 degrees. Now, this is where we start to see substantial public health risk in these conditions. So this is happening likely, according to the models, sometime around year 2070 or so. But we're already starting to see evidence that, you know, what was 4 days per year is now 10 days per year, and so on and so forth. So we have to really start preparing for these changes in extreme heat. As was mentioned previously, some of the biggest wildfires have occurred in the past couple decades. In fact, if you go back to the reliable record to 1932, you can see that the largest wildfires, I think it's 8 of the top 10, have occurred in the past 2 decades. And we can see that the Thomas and Mendocino complex, which occurred over the past couple of years, were the largest ever in California's history. So we're seeing an intensification of heat, and we are seeing more and more wildfires in California. Also, this is quite noteworthy that not only was the Camp Fire devastating, where we saw around 85 fatalities. These are before and after pictures of the school that was burnt down. We had some of the children from the school at an event we held at UC Davis where they were learning more about climate change and what's going on, and it was both sad and uplifting to talk to them about the fact that they don't have a school to go to. But it's estimated there are around $16 billion of damages from this singular event, which was the most expensive sort of natural disaster in the world that occurred last year. And that 16.5 billion does not include the fact that the water is not drinkable in these environments anymore for a number of reasons. And you think about the loss of business, the loss of schools, so on and so forth, that this is really a conservative estimate of the real impacts of a single fire event. So these are things that are hurting people, they're hurting the economy, and it's making us very vulnerable. So as was mentioned, yeah, then this was a tweet I put out during the fire as they closed down campus, and this is showing side-by-side comparison of some of the sensors that have been deployed to monitor PM 2.5, which is particularly matter 2.5 that can lodge into your lungs and cause major health risks. India, which has more or less the worst air quality in the country, and here we are in Sacramento, seeing that we are above and beyond what India was experiencing for those few days. So not only was the fire devastating to those local communities, but it didn't just stay in Paradise, it cascaded throughout the entire northern part of the state. So let's map these together. Here we have several quadrats where you can look at the climate data, and you can map with those climate data sort of hot and dry conditions, hot and wet, sort of cool conditions. And you can see over time as you go from dark colors to the red colors, it's moving forward in history. And the biggest wildfires in terms of acreage, as well as the most destructive in terms of damages, are shown in squares and diamonds. And you can see that they're highly correlated, that as we hit these hot, dry conditions, we've been seeing more and more, the incidence of extreme wildfires has been growing in the state. Now, we know scientifically that while there's a good reason to believe that these are causal, there are other factors such as fire suppression, changes in ecology, so on and so forth, that we need to consider to really diagnose the signature of climate in these changes. And a number of studies have done that. First, starting back in about 2006, there was a paper published that showed sort of hot, dry springs was the most highly correlated with changes in fire that we were seeing. As the science became more sophisticated, using diagnostic tools and attribution of climate to start to disentangle the multiple causal factors behind the changes. We started to see that around 39 to 64% of the fire was actually being caused by climate and climate change. And then more recently, an analysis showed that about half of the fire that we're seeing in the western US is actually bearing the signature of a change in climate. So I'd say that right now the consensus view based on the science and the attribution of climate data is that at least half of the change in fire severity, fire extent, fire season is being driven by climate. In the future, well, based on an ensemble of global climate models, using the business as usual scenario, which currently we are on in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, it's likely that we'll see about a 77% increase in mean wildfire throughout the state compared to the baseline condition of 1961 to 1990. And that extreme wildfires, these will be mega wildfires that we've never really recorded, start to appear in the models with a higher frequency and a 50% probability that we'll be seeing fires that will make the previous fires look actually kind of small by comparison. So this is work from my group that recognizes that not only are we changing the climate, but in response, the vegetation in California will change dramatically. On the left side, we have the fraction of grass. High fraction is in darker colors. A low fraction is in red. In the in the right side, there's the tree fraction. I'm just going to stand up because my neck is going to go out on me. And in the upper right, we have the RCP 2.6 scenario, which I call the rear view mirror scenario because we've already eclipsed that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the only scenario where we don't see a dramatic change in terms of trees and grasses in the state. And then we can look at a range of other scenarios. I would like to point out RCP 8.5, which is business as usual, which is just to the upper right in both of those. And there you can see that we start to lose trees throughout most of the state. So there will be some self-correction going on as trees disappear in favor of grasses, but we're going to be stuck in this transition for a few decades as these wildfires continue. Now, what can we do about it? Well, fuel treatments do have the capacity to reduce wildfire risk. In fact, a suite of models have shown that you can see a 16 to 31% reduction if you strategically thin and undergo controlled burning. What we see here is 3 different scenarios of a control condition, an accelerated condition where we go in and do extreme thinning at about 25% per year, and then a sort of tamped down version of that, which is called distributed, which would be around a 10% thinning per year. The bright red colors indicate extreme wildfire, and the lighter indicate less extreme. And you can see that thinning will reduce the incidence of some extreme wildfire events, which is a good thing. And this just came out a couple days ago, and not being a medical scientist, I'm hazard to talk too much about the medical impact, but this showed that kids who are exposed to prescribed burns they show detectably more positive indication in the Th1 cells of health compared to populations that have been exposed to wildfire, and really not that different from control populations. So these are preliminary data suggesting that controlled burns, while they can release some bad toxics to the air, they release fewer toxics as shown in the black bars versus the gray compared to wildfire. And so this is a way to really help not only assist in reducing wildfire, but it seems to show up in the data in terms of resulting in better health of kids. So how are we going to put this all together? Well, it is expensive, and the state is investing around $250 million right now in wildfire risk prevention. But there are other pathways, and in California, we're starting to see the emergence of green bonds, where investors will give money to municipalities such as industries that are using hydropower. Those industries will then deploy a workforce to go in and clear out forest environments, reduce wildfire risk. That's a return on investment for them because there's no longer mudslides and things that are choking up the hydropower plants, and then they return that money over time to investors. So these green bonds do provide a really interesting new way to start funding the activities. So I'll just end with this as we turn over to the panel, not being a medical expert at all. Are we entering a point in time now where we think that climate change should be treated as a pandemic? And the reason I say this is if you look at the extreme events that are appearing and you look at all the different ways in which it hurts people, whether it's lung health or water supplies or food security, this is a problem that is already indicating, based on the data, that we're seeing over 250 million people worldwide exposed to these events and dying prematurely. And I think that kind of rises to the level of what I would consider a pandemic, but it's obviously quite different in terms of the way that it manifests itself. So I think this is a major question that I'm hoping we can make inroads on as we move forward in solving the challenge. Thank you.
Will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. I would ask Leon Jolin, who is joining us from Colorado, to talk next. While this forum is largely focused on the California wildfires, as I think we all know, and certainly will be made clear, wildfires have been a problem throughout the western states, certainly in Washington and Colorado and elsewhere. So with that, Leanne, who is the Executive Director of the San Juan Basin Public Health in Durango, Colorado. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I just got to grab my glasses.